'cause you're only a man, and a man's got to learn to take it. Try to believe, though the going gets rough, that you gotta hang tough to make it. History repeats itself.
Welcome back, folks, to 360 Sports Network, 3S Network on Twitter. We are discussing tonight the irrelevant positions, the kickers, and we are also going to get into defenses. But first, let's talk about those irrelevant kickers. Mr. Dodson, how irrelevant is the kicker right now?
You know how much I love the kicker in the game of fantasy football. Now, I will kid you not, I do think that the kicker behind the quarterback is the most important position on a football team. But when it comes to a fantasy football team, I am not a fan of the kicker because there's just not much value when the difference between the top kicker and the 16th kicker is about 1.5 points per game at the absolute most. But we'll get more into those details. But at the same time, though, you do need points from your kicker to help get you that victory, and going and picking out a good kicker can be the difference. They might all be very similar, but they all have their special qualities that can help you out.
Yes, as a matter of fact, our crack staff of analytic researchers based from the Institute of Sports Technology, IST, has come up with 3 variables that we must look at when assessing a fantasy football kicker. One of the variables, of course, are teams that score beaucoup numbers of points. Beaucoup being French for a heck of a lot of points. The second variable are teams that kick in high altitudes. And the third variable, of course, are teams that stall out in the red zone. And with that said, Mr. Dodson, what are your analysis based upon those 3 variables as to the most coveted kickers to be drafted in their fantasy football league?
Well, I guess I would first of all say what kicker could possibly fit into multiple of those categories. And the obvious answer there would be Matt Prater, because obviously Denver scores big-time points, and, well, they play in Denver. So that means he's kicking 60, 65-yard field goals decently regularly, and that's the bonus points that you normally get in a standard league, getting as much as a 2 or 3 point bonus for making a 50-yard field goal. So Matt Prater is the guy who sticks out most because he fits in multiple categories there.
I would have to agree with that. This is a team that basically, on 2 factors here, they put up multiple numbers of points. So you're going to have a lot of 1-point dink-and-dunks. And by the way, folks, in case you've been confused by the rule changes in the NFL, they're still allowing extra point conversions this year.
Right. They're doing a little test in the preseason. They've moved the extra point back to be like a 35-yard field goal. That's just a test. You'll actually see it back to the normal 20-yard field goal extra point coming up in the rest of the preseason. So don't think that that's going to change anything. It's still the same old kickers that we've been seeing for the past decade. And I think that makes a big point, though, is that, you still are getting the quote-unquote automatic extra point, which makes the high-scoring teams like Denver or, say, Shane Graham in New Orleans very high commodities, because they can be kicking well over 50, maybe even 60 extra points this year.
That's correct. Now, another category which we have to take a look at, of course, is the teams that stall out in the red zone quite often. And the kicker that comes to mind when you're addressing that particular category would be Dan Bailey from Dallas.
Oh, definitely. They definitely struggle, especially when they are as injury-prone as they are. It ends up being that Dan Bailey is kicking a lot of field goals. And the other thing for him and another guy, Adam Vinatieri, that's really evident is look how many field goals are in that intermediate range. And by intermediate, I mean your scoring normally gives you 3 points for a field goal under 40 yards. Then you get a bonus point, so it's worth 4 points if it's in a 40-yard range, and then it's worth 5 points if it's in the 50-yard range. Vinatieri and Bailey are head and shoulders above the rest when it comes to that mid-range kick. of the 40 to 49 yards. You see them with double-digit kicks almost every year. Stephen Hauschka in Seattle, another one that ends up with the same thing with almost double-digit field goals in that range every year. It's kind of interesting how that works, but at the same time, if you know your team's going to stall in the red zone quite often, that's a kicker that you want to have on your team.
Right, exactly. Now, we kind of say this tongue-in-cheek as we address this as, quote, the irrelevant show when we're talking about the kickers because of the statistical difference between the top kicker and the bottom kicker. However, let's talk about the importance of a kicker on a fantasy football team itself. Now, you and I have diverse opinions on this, and yes, statistically, you are 100% correct that this is a position that you really don't want to waste a whole lot of time on, a whole lot of sweat. But on the same token, drafting a good kicker, especially in the very late rounds, could propel you towards success, depending upon how you want to use the and how you want to use this position itself.
Right, and if you can use the kicker in that proper fashion, especially a team that has a late bye week. For example, the Dan Bailey, the Adam Vinatieri, even Stephen Gostkowski, who we haven't even mentioned, and he's at the top of our projected stats for the year. Having a guy like that for the first 9, 10, or even 11 weeks of your season before having to make a waiver wire move for a replacement could be huge dividends versus whether you have, say, a guy lower on the end, maybe a Greg Zerlin from St. Louis, who you're going to have to get rid of after 3 weeks anyway. So you can kind of play the bye week game as well as the what do I expect from you type atmosphere from the beginning.
Now, it's always interesting as I watch people draft in fantasy football where they draft their favorite kickers in various and interesting rounds. Oftentimes I've seen kickers go as high as in the 8th round. And I just look at them and shake my head. But I really believe that if you want to be competitive, don't take a kicker earlier than the 12th round.
Yeah, in a standard league, honestly, I only take a kicker still if I am required to. Like I've said before, the difference between in a 12-team league between the best starting kicker and the worst starting kicker is 1.3 points per game. That's what's projected for this year. That's not enough for me to worry about it. I'll take my risk on a guy who might have a little upside, especially not knowing what could happen with injuries in the last couple weeks of preseason. But if I can, or if I need to take a kicker, I'll wait until the last round because, like we've said here, we've already mentioned about 7 or 8 kickers who I'm pretty excited about and would love to have on my team for the various reasons. So I'm not in any rush to go out and get somebody any earlier than that because someone like, even if, Gostkowski, Prater go early, guys like Dan Bailey or even Phil Dawson, obviously struggling in San Francisco, with San Francisco having some red zone issues as well, a lot of short field goals there. They're all going to be available. I can get at least one of them.
Right, and even such, take a look at players like Sean Sleasem, for instance, and Blair Walsh. Both teams that sometimes have trouble converting, within the 20. But they're definitely monsters, between the 20s. But once they get to that red zone, they have a tendency to stall out. Those are kickers that you can get some decent points. The same thing with Graham Gano and, Kai Forbath. Once again, if you're looking at somebody that's going to get you anywhere between 6 to 10 points a game, these are all people that can do this for you. And once again, when you're looking at the kicking position on your team, I always anchor your thought pattern in playing fantasy football based around the rule of 100 or 101 points. If your team can get you that 100 to 100 points constantly per game, then you are going to be on the path to get to the playoffs. So with that said, if you factor a value of 6 to 8 points for your kicker, that's basically where you want to basically start, looking at filling that particular position. And then you build the rest of the team around those point values that can get you close to that 100 to 101 points per game.
Right, and getting 6 or 7 points, that's 2 field goals, or that's a field goal and 3 extra points, which are both very, very common entities in the modern game. And what kills you with fantasy football, though, is that don't get disappointed if a guy, if your kicker one week only gets, 3 or 4 points because they scored 3 or 4 touchdowns and didn't kick any field goals. There's nothing you can do about that. We saw that with Vinatieri last year. He had 3 straight weeks of double-digit points, and then the next week they scored 1 touchdown. That was it. There's nothing the kicker can do about that. It's just the way the game is. Speaking of Vinatieri, another thing to look at, we talked about kickers playing in high altitude. Kind of going along with that, it almost serves as high altitude. Guys who are kicking in domes, not having to worry about the weather elements, especially later in the year. So you have, obviously Vinatieri in Indianapolis. Shane Graham in New Orleans becomes a great player in that regard as well. You can look with Matt Bryant in Atlanta, same idea. Dome kickers can definitely make a difference.
Oh, most definitely, most definitely. And, of course, if you're looking at dome kickers who have teams installed in the red zone, once again, you could be in the bonus there as well. But I think the thing to kind of keep in mind, number one, is don't get too hung up on the analytics. Because, as you mentioned earlier, Mr. Dotson, there's only a very, very small variance between your top kicker and the bottom kicker.
And when you find that there was a gap, that your kicker's not doing as well as you may have liked in those early weeks, there's going to be a couple kickers on the waiver wire who are more than worthy of picking up, who can get you big points. And even when you pick them up, they could have a couple bad weeks themselves. You can never tell for sure what's going to happen. You can't predict which kicker is going to have the 7 field goal week. You just can't do it. Don't try to.
No. It's the football gods are the ones who are fickle. Well, thank you for listening to our irrelevant show on fantasy football kickers. And really, all this analysis isn't irrelevant. It's basically stuff that can actually help you figure out what to do with your kickers on the waiver wire. Until next time, I'm the Mad Scientist, and that's Mr. Valiant Man, James Dotson. Have a good night.